It's still 2 Timothy chapter 3, and we're still in this. Well, it's kind of an ugly list of negative, even destructive character qualities. It's a profile of a person or people who create for us in these last days. He says in verse 1, but mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. And then he goes on to describe how people will be. And it's my belief that how people will be is what makes these last days terrible times. We've gone through people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. Have nothing to do with such people. Well, we talked about without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous. And then Paul includes this, rash. See, what makes a person rash, in my opinion, is the fact that they don't think about consequences. They don't, basically they don't think. They, instead of responding, they only react. You can see this virtually anywhere. Think about your experiences at work. Think about your experiences in social settings and in family life. One of the most difficult challenges in helping couples figure out how to create essentially a new marriage out of a deeply conflicted one is helping them learn to respond instead of react. Our reactions have their root in more than one thing. It's not like, oh, if you just do this one thing, then you're going to be able to respond instead of react. It's not that easy. If it were that easy, well, I wish it were. It's not, though. And some of the reasons why our reactions and our behaviors are rash is because, first of all, we never saw response modeled. We only saw, as kids, we only saw reaction. This is really big. If you're a parent or a grandparent, it is so difficult to not react to what seems to you to be an obviously bad behavior of your child or your grandchild. There are so many advantages to learning how to respond instead of merely react. And one of them is you can model for, actually it comes down to, you can model for anybody you're in some kind of relationship with what it looks like to respond rather than reacting. Most arguments that become full-fledged conflicts that I have had anything to do with, both as a participant and observer, and then as a counselor for people who are trying to figure out how do they undo the damage. Well, they start with reaction, not response. I won't say in every case, but in many cases, I think it's safe for me to say most cases, when a person responds instead of reacting, they often can reduce the level of conflict so that instead of it all being way up here on an emotional level, it can be way up here on a rational level. Well, rash people are basically not rational. I'm not accusing them, well, I guess maybe I am accusing them of not. I don't think it's always they don't have the tools, but they don't use tools to move the whole thing in the opposite direction. Instead of it being one reaction against another reaction against one rash behavior or rash comment against another and back and forth until you have this, it's a war. Sometimes people under the same roof get into a war of words and condemning and cold reactions. They shut one another out because of rash words and behaviors. You know what? I didn't have to go that big with the whole idea of rash. Rash people create terrible times. And then they're conceited. I have a real strong conviction that treacherous, rash, conceited, everything on this list leads to a basic profile of a conceited person. Well, what most marks conceited people is their high estimate of themselves. Not just that, though. It's their high estimate of themselves and their low estimate of everyone else. That's what conceit is. Wow. Every once in a while I look at this list and I think, I am looking in the mirror. Dadgummit. And then he goes on, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. This is, I think, one of the defining marks of our culture today. We love pleasure. How many? Well, let's just put it into one kind of subculture, one context. If you're a TV watcher, I'm not even talking about the plot lines of the shows you watch. Now I'm going to look at just the commercials. How many commercials appeal to a person's love of pleasure? I've never sat down and done an empirical study of this, though I'm sure probably someone has. Just my anecdotal observing comes down to 90 or 95% of the commercials that play when I'm watching TV are appealing to my love of pleasure. More, bigger, better, newer. While I was watching the golf this past weekend, the PGA tournament, a Cadillac commercial kept coming up. It seemed like every commercial break there. Cadillacs are nice cars. I'm not against Cadillac, but this commercial, number one, it had about 4% of the whole body of the commercial was about the performance of the car, and maybe less than 4% because the performance of the car was all about plug it in. It's an all-electric car. The rest of it was about how interesting and inspiring and how intriguing and how, and they left off two very important characteristics of the owner of this, or the purchaser of this car. One is you got to be rich, and the other is you got to be shallow. It's all. I'm just up to here with the number of the sheer volume of stuff that gets dumped into my living room nonstop. It feels like that are simply and purely an appeal to my love of pleasure. Okay, that's part of it, but it's only half and maybe less than half. Here's the other half that bothers me. There are a few commercials like that Cadillac commercial I'm telling you about that kind of grind me. But you know what? There's a whole lot of other commercials that I'm thinking, I would love to have that. Okay. But Paul didn't stop with lovers of pleasure. I mean, see, well, what he said was lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. What has happened is that we have replaced the one true God, Jehovah, Yahweh, with an idol, a false god of pleasure. And it gets worse, in my opinion. When I replace the one true God with this idol of pleasure, pleasure quickly it becomes, it shifts from the love of pleasure to it's all about me, so that I become my own God. Paul, he's not mincing words. This whole thing, this whole profile is direct, and there's no softness to it. It's not like an iron fist in a velvet glove. He took the glove off, and here they are lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Now, here's the deal. Can you love pleasure and love God at the same time? That's interesting. I feel that's an interesting question, and it's one that's a little difficult to parse and work your way through. I don't know that it's impossible to love pleasure and love God, but one or the other will always win out. Either I will love God more than pleasure, or I will love pleasure more than God. Jesus said you can't serve two masters. You will either love the one or hate the other. Well, that's what this is about. Either God is your treasure or pleasure is your treasure. One quick thing that this raises for me is, so am I supposed to hate pleasure? I don't think that's not the solution to this whole thing. I think the point is keep pleasure in its context. Is it wrong for me to enjoy something? You fill in the blank. If it's not morally wrong, if it doesn't break with God's written, expressed moral standards, I think I'm good. I think enjoy it. Paul wrote to Timothy, everything is given to us for our enjoyment, but it's to be received with thanksgiving. Okay, we have to balance my love of God with my love of pleasure. And we're not very good at that. Okay, coming back to it next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.